March 8, 1941. Vincent Calibri walked into the Apollo Theater and spat in Bumpy Johnson's face. 200 witnesses expected instant violence, but Bumpy just smiled and whispered, "Count to 50." 50 minutes later, the mafia families received a message scattered across New York in exactly 50 pieces. What did Bumpy Johnson do that made every gangster in America never test him again? To understand how it all led here, the story goes back to where it truly began. The Apollo Theater, Harlem, March 8, 1941. 11:32 at night. 200 people watched as Vincent "Vinny Spit" Calibri walked up to Bumpy Johnson's table, leaned over and spat directly in his face. Time slowed. The spit hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, catching the stage lights like a diamond bullet. The droplet arced through the smoke-filled room, spinning, falling, inevitable. Then it struck Bumpy's left cheek. The sound, amplified by the sudden silence, was like a gunshot. Splat. The spit ran down Bumpy's face, a slow crawl, toward his jaw, dripping onto his pressed white shirt collar. The jazz band stopped mid-note. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Ice cubes stopped clinking in glasses. Even Ella Fitzgerald, mid-verse on stage, let her voice trail into nothing. 200 people stopped breathing, because everyone in that room knew what happened next when you disrespected Bumpy Johnson. They expected guns. They expected blood. They expected bodies hitting the floor before the echo faded. They expected Vinny Calibri to be dead before his heart beat twice more. Instead, Bumpy Johnson reached for his napkin. White linen, folded perfectly beside his plate. He picked it up slowly, methodically, like a man with all the time in the world. Wiped his left cheek. Once. Wiped his jaw. Once. Wiped his shirt collar. Once. Then he folded the napkin, precise angles, perfect creases. The shape of a coffin. He placed it on the table, aligned it with the edge of his plate, and looked up at Vincent Calibri. Their eyes met. Vinny was still smiling, that arrogant, triumphant smile. The smile of a man who thought he'd just won. But something in his eyes flickered, just for a second. Doubt, fear, recognition of something wrong. Bumpy stood up, slow, deliberate, 5'9", facing down 6'2". But somehow in that moment, Bumpy seemed taller. His shadow on the wall behind him stretched 10 feet high. "Count to 50, Bumpy said. His voice was quiet. So quiet that people at the far tables leaned forward to hear, but every syllable cut through the silence like a blade. Vinny's smile faltered. "What, 50, Bumpy repeated. "That's how many pieces we're going to find you in." Vinny tried to laugh, nervous, confused. The sound came out wrong, strangled. "You threatening me in front of all these people?" "You know who I work for. I know exactly who you work for," Bumpy said. "And after tonight, they're going to know exactly who I am." Vinny's 4 bodyguards shifted behind him. One of them, younger than the others, looked nervous. His hand moved toward his jacket, but Bumpy held up one finger. "Wait." The gesture was so calm, so controlled, that everyone understood. This wasn't fear. This was something else entirely. This was a promise. What nobody in that room knew, what the 200 witnesses couldn't see, was that Bumpy Johnson had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks. And the clock had just started ticking on Vincent Calibri's last 50 minutes alive. But to understand how that night ended in 50 pieces scattered across 7 different locations in 3 different boroughs, you need to understand where it began. You need to understand Harlem in 1941. You need to understand the kingdom Bumpy Johnson built with patience, intelligence, and a kind of power most men never recognize until it's too late. Harlem in March 1941 was a place where darkness and light danced together every single day, where hope and despair walked the same streets, where jazz music floated out of clubs like prayers and numbers, runners moved through alleys like ghosts, World War II was raging across Europe. Young black men were enlisting, hoping that fighting for America would finally earn them the respect they'd been denied at home. But in Harlem, a different kind of war was being fought. A war over money, over territory, over respect. The numbers racket was pulling in millions of dollars every week. Poor folks betting pennies on 3-digit numbers, hoping their luck would change. Hoping that maybe, just maybe, their number would hit and they could pay rent, buy food, send their kids to school. It was a game of hope. And the Italian mafia families wanted to control every penny of it. They'd tried for years to take Harlem, sent soldiers, sent negotiators, sent bribes. Nothing worked, because Harlem had Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson, at 35 years old, was not the biggest man. 5'9", maybe 170 pounds. But he had something that size couldn't give you: presence. When Bumpy walked into a room, people noticed. Not because he was loud, not because he was flashy, but because he was the opposite. Quiet. Calculated. The kind of man who spoke softly and made you lean in to hear him. The kind of man whose silence was more terrifying than other men's threats. He wasn't just a gangster. He was an architect. An architect of power built not on fear but on something more dangerous. Loyalty. Respect. Trust. Every morning, Bumpy walked through Harlem. Stopped at Ernestine's Bakery on 133rd Street, bought bread, left a $50 bill under his coffee cup. The old woman never knew where the money came from, but her lights stayed on every month. Bumpy stopped at PS 119, handed an envelope to the principal. No name attached. Just money. Enough to keep 3 kids in school whose parents couldn't pay. He stopped at Mrs. Patterson's building on Lenox Avenue, paid her back rent before the landlord could evict her. She never knew it was him. They called him the Godfather of Harlem. But to the people who lived there, who struggled there, who raised their children there, he was something else. He was the bank when banks wouldn't lend to black folks. He was the judge when the justice system ignored them. He was the shield when the police looked the other way. This wasn't charity. This was strategy. Bumpy understood something that men like Vincent Calibri would never understand. Real power doesn't come from making people fear you. It comes from making them choose you. When the people of Harlem looked at Bumpy Johnson, they didn't see a criminal. They saw a protector. And that loyalty, that genuine respect, was worth more than 1,000 armed soldiers. But power built on respect required something most men didn't have: patience, discipline, and the wisdom to know when not to use violence. The wisdom Bumpy learned the hard way, carved into his soul, when he was just 10 years old. South Carolina, 1916. Young Bumpy standing in the street outside his family's home, watching 2 white police officers push his father to his knees. His father, William Johnson, a dignified man who worked 2 jobs to feed his family. On his knees in the mud. The officers laughing, one of them spitting on his father's head, the spit running down his father's face, dripping onto his work shirt. Young Bumpy's hand closed around a rock, heavy, sharp. He could throw it. He was good at throwing. He could hit one of those officers in the head. Make them stop. Make them pay. But his father looked at him. Just one look. A look that said, "Don't. Not now. Not like this." The officers left. His father stood up, brushed the mud off his knees, wiped the spit from his face. Never said a word about it. But that night, young Bumpy heard his mother crying in the next room, heard his father's voice, low and steady. "I'm not angry because I'm weak. I'm patient because I'm smart. The day will come when we don't have to kneel. But that day isn't today." Bumpy made a promise to himself that night. A promise he'd kept for 25 years. He would never kneel. And anyone who tried to make him kneel would never stand up again. But he also learned the other half of his father's lesson: patience, strategy, the understanding that real power wasn't about the violence you did. It was about the violence you could do but chose not to, until the moment you had no choice, until the moment that violence sent a message so clear, so absolute, that it never had to be repeated. In his office above Small's Paradise, Bumpy kept 2 books on his desk: The Prince by Machiavelli and The Art of War by Sun Tzu. He'd read them both a dozen times, memorized passages, underlined sections. One line he'd circled in red ink gone over so many times the page was nearly worn through. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But Bumpy had added his own note in the margin: wrong, best to be both. But if they make you choose, make them understand why they should have chosen differently. That was Bumpy's philosophy. That was the foundation of his power. 3 principles he followed without exception. First, patience and strategy. Never react. Always respond. Reaction is emotion. Response is calculation. Take time. Gather information. Plan 10 steps ahead. Second, retaliation must be proportional and purposeful. Don't just hurt them, teach them. Make the lesson so clear that everyone watching understands the principle. Third, send a message that lasts. Violence fades. Bodies are buried and forgotten. But fear that's built on understanding, on the knowledge that consequences are inevitable, that power is patient but absolute, that kind of fear lasts generations. These principles had kept Bumpy alive and in power for 15 years. While other gangsters rose fast and fell faster, Bumpy endured. While others built empires on intimidation and watched them crumble when someone more violent came along, Bumpy's kingdom stood firm. Because it wasn't built on fear. It was built on choice. And people chose Bumpy Johnson because they understood that following him meant protection, prosperity, and respect. But those 3 principles were about to be tested in a way they'd never been tested before. Because across the ocean in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, a man named Vito Genovese was losing his patience. Vito, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America, was in exile. Fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges. Ran his empire from across the Atlantic through letters, phone calls, and messengers. And every month his empire was shrinking. The Luciano family was taking territory. The Gambinos were taking soldiers. And in Harlem, a black man was taking money. Millions of dollars that should have been flowing into Genovese's pockets. 3 weeks before the Apollo Theater incident, Vito Genovese made a phone call to New York. His brother Michael answered. Brother Vito said, his voice tight with rage, "I hear we're losing $3 million a year to a man in Harlem." Michael Genovese, 30 years old, and desperate to prove himself worthy of the family name, gripped the phone. "Yes. Bumpy Johnson. He controls the numbers racket up there. We've tried negotiating. We've tried pressure. Nothing works." "Then you're not trying hard enough." Vito's voice dropped to a whisper. "Michael, listen to me carefully. This is not about money anymore. This is about respect. If the 5 families think we can't control one black neighborhood, we look weak. And weakness is death in our business. What do you want me to do? I don't want you to kill him. Killing him makes him a martyr. His people will love him more when he's dead. No, I want you to break him. Publicly. Humiliate him in front of his own people. Make Harlem see that their king can't protect them, that he's just another man who bleeds. And when they see that, they'll turn on him themselves." Silence on the line. Then Michael said, "I have an idea." 2 days later, Michael Genovese called a meeting at the social club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. The room smelled of cigars and espresso. 8 men sat around a table covered with maps of New York City, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, each neighborhood marked with different colored pins: red for Genovese territory, blue for Luciano, green for Gambino. And in the middle of Harlem, one black pin: Bumpy Johnson. Michael stood at the head of the table, pointing at the black pin. "This man," he said, his voice rising, "makes us look weak. He controls Harlem like it's his own country. The other families laugh at us. They say we can't even handle one neighborhood, one man." The captains around the table shifted uncomfortably. They'd all heard the stories about Bumpy Johnson, stories about negotiations that ended with Genovese soldiers in the hospital, stories about threats that were answered with bodies, stories about a man who moved like a ghost and struck like lightning. "So what's the plan?" one captain asked. Michael smiled. "We don't go after him with guns. We go after his image. We show Harlem that their king is just a man who can be disrespected, a man who won't do anything because he can't afford a war with us." Another captain frowned. "How?" That's when Vincent Calibri spoke up from the corner of the room. "I'll spit in his face." The room went silent. Vincent "Vinny Spit" Calibri was Michael's enforcer. 6'2", 240 pounds of muscle and rage. They called him Vinny Spit because of what he'd done to a numbers runner in Brooklyn who tried to hold back money. Beat the man unconscious, then spat on him as he lay bleeding. The ultimate sign of disrespect. Vinny had killed 7 men in his career. All of them quick, brutal, efficient. "You'll do what Michael asked. I'll walk into his territory, into a place where all his people can see. And I'll spit in his face, right there, in front of everyone. And when he doesn't do anything because he can't start a war with us, his people will see him for what he really is, just another man pretending to be a king." Michael stared at Vinny. Then he started to smile. "That's good. That's very good. You do this, Vinny, and I'll give you your own crew, a Harlem crew, under Genovese control." Vinny nodded. "Give me 3 weeks. I'll make Bumpy Johnson look like a coward in front of his own people." But what Michael and Vinny didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had eyes everywhere, and ears that heard everything. There was a man named Marcus who cleaned toilets and emptied ashtrays at the Mulberry Street Social Club. 62 years old. Invisible to the Genovese captains. Just another black janitor. They talked in front of him like he wasn't there. Like he was furniture. Like he didn't exist. But Marcus existed, and he had a very good memory. Marcus heard every word of that meeting. Every detail of the plan. Vinny's boasts, Michael's approval, the timeline, the target. Everything. That night at 2 in the morning, Marcus walked through the rain to Small's Paradise, knocked on the back door, asked to see Mr. Johnson. The guard at the door knew Marcus, waved him through. Upstairs in his office, Bumpy was still awake, reading the newspaper, a glass of whiskey on his desk. Marcus walked in, dripping water on the floor. "Mr. Johnson, I have information." Bumpy looked up, gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. Tell me." Marcus told him everything. The meeting. The plan. Vinny's boasts. Michael's approval. When he finished, Bumpy sat in silence for a long moment. Just thinking. Calculating. Then he opened his desk drawer, pulled out 5 $100 bills and handed them to Marcus. "You didn't see anything. You didn't hear anything. Understand?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson." But before Marcus could leave, he stopped at the door, turned back. "Mr. Johnson, if I may say something." Bumpy nodded. "Show them who you are, sir. Show them why you're the king." After Marcus left, Bumpy sat alone in his office for 2 hours, just thinking. He could kill Vincent Calibri before the man even made his move. 1 phone call, 1 bullet. Problem solved. Simple. Clean. Efficient. But that wouldn't solve the real problem. The Genovese family would just send someone else. The tests would keep coming. The challenges would never stop. Not until he sent a message so clear, so terrifying, so absolute that no one would ever dare test him again. He needed to make an example. Not just of Vinny Calibri, but of the very idea of disrespecting him. He needed to create a legend, a story so horrifying that it would be told for decades, a warning that would echo through every mafia family, every criminal organization, every man who thought about testing Bumpy Johnson. He picked up the phone, made 3 calls. The first call went to Junie Bird, real name Julius Bird, 35 years old. Former engineer before he went into the life. Junie was the strategist, the planner, the man who could look at a problem and see 17 different solutions. His mind worked like a chess master, always thinking 5 moves ahead. Junie Bumpy said, "I need you at the Apollo Theater on March 8th. Dress nice. Bring your tools. When I give the signal, you're going to follow a man. Watch him. And when the time is right, bring him to the spot." The spot. Junie knew what that meant. He'd helped Bumpy prepare several spots over the years, places where problems disappeared. He didn't ask questions, just said, "I'll be ready." The second call went to Illinois Gordon, 40 years old, former heavyweight boxer, 47 fights, 43 knockouts. Illinois was pure force. When diplomacy failed, when strategy wasn't enough. Illinois was the hammer that broke whatever needed breaking. Illinois Bumpy said, same message, March 8th, Apollo Theater, follow my signal. Illinois' response was even simpler, done. The third call went to Raymond Quick Lewis, 28 years old, the youngest of Bumpy's inner circle. But Raymond had a gift. He understood people, could read a man's fears like a book, could find the psychological pressure point and push until grown men cried like children. Raymond didn't need to use violence often. His words, his presence, his eyes were weapons enough. Raymond Bumpy said, March 8th. You know what to do. Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson, always. After the calls, Bumpy stood up and walked to the window, looked out over Harlem, his kingdom, the streets he'd protected, the people he'd served, the empire he'd built not with fear, but with respect. And he made a decision. Vincent Calibri would spit in his face. Bumpy would let him walk out of the Apollo Theater alive, would let him think he'd won. And then over the next 50 minutes, Bumpy would teach the entire underworld a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, Junie Bird went to Red Hook, Brooklyn, to a warehouse that had been abandoned for years. Empty, dark, perfect. He brought tools, rope, lights, a chair, heavy-duty bolts, a drain in the center of the floor that led straight to the East River. Junie worked for 3 days preparing, building, testing, making sure everything would work exactly as Bumpy wanted. By the time he was finished, the warehouse was ready. A theater for a very specific performance. Meanwhile, Bumpy studied Vincent Calibri, asked questions, gathered information, learned everything about the man, his habits, his psychology, his weaknesses, and he found the key. Vinny's pride, the man's absolute certainty in his own superiority, his belief that violence was the only language of power, that pride would be his downfall. Bumpy also made a map, spread it across his desk, marked 7 locations with red X's, Red Hook, East River, Bronx, Queens, Mulberry Street. Each location carefully chosen, strategic, symbolic. Together they would spell out a message that every criminal in New York would understand. This is what happens when you disrespect Bumpy Johnson. But Bumpy didn't just prepare the trap. He baited it. Made sure Vincent Calibri would walk into it exactly the way Bumpy wanted. Week 1. 7 black roses appeared on Vincent Calibri's doorstep. 1 each morning. No card, no message, just black roses. Vinny threw them away, laughed about it, but his girlfriend noticed that he didn't sleep well that week. Week 2. Vinny started noticing people watching him, on corners, in cars, outside his apartment. He'd look directly at them and they'd vanish, like ghosts. He told himself it was nothing. but he started carrying 2 guns instead of 1. Week 3. An invitation arrived at the Mulberry Street Social Club. Expensive paper, elegant handwriting. It read, "Mr. Vincent Calibri is cordially invited to the Apollo Theater on March 8, 1941. A special performance. I'll be waiting." No signature. Vinny showed it to Michael Genovese. "Look at this. He's inviting me. He knows I'm coming." Michael smiled. "He's trying to intimidate you, trying to make you scared." "I'm not scared," Vinny said. "This just makes it better. I'll walk into his invitation and spit in his face, show him I'm not afraid." And that was exactly what Bumpy had calculated. Vinny's pride wouldn't let him back down. The invitation would make him more determined, more confident, more certain of his victory, and more isolated. Because a man that confident would want to savor his victory alone. Bumpy had set the perfect trap. Now he just had to wait for Vincent Calibri to step into it. But there was one more thing Bumpy had to do before March 8th. One conversation he had to have. The hardest conversation. The one with his wife. March 7th, 1941. The night before, everything would change. Bumpy came home late as usual. His brownstone on 136th Street was dark except for one light in the bedroom. Mamie was awake, sitting at her vanity removing her earrings. She was 42 years old, elegant, educated, the daughter of a doctor. She'd married Bumpy knowing exactly who he was and what he did. Never judged him, never asked him to change. But she knew him well enough to read the signs. "You're going to do something tomorrow," she said. Not a question, a statement. Bumpy closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed. "Yes." "Something you can't take back." He didn't answer immediately. Mamie turned around on her stool, looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but he could see the fear there. Not fear of him. Fear for him. "I'm not afraid of what you'll do," she said softly. "I'm afraid of what it might change in you. I married a man who was strong enough to not use his strength. What happens when you have to use it?" Bumpy reached out, took her hand. "Mamie," he said, "love sometimes means becoming the monster so the people you love don't have to. You, the children in Harlem, the old women who sleep safely because they know I'm watching. They get to stay human because I'm willing to be something else when necessary." Mamie's eyes filled with tears. "And who protects you from becoming that monster permanently?" "You do," Bumpy said. "You remind me why I do this. You remind me what I'm protecting." She stood up, walked to him, put her hands on his face. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to teach the world that there are lines you don't cross. That respect isn't optional. That Harlem belongs to the people who live here, not the people who want to take from it. And I'm going to do it in a way that no one will ever forget." "How many pieces?" Mamie whispered. She'd heard the stories, knew the legends of Bumpy's previous lessons. 50. Mamie closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the tears were gone. She kissed him. Once. Gentle. Then she said, "Then make sure the lesson is worth it. Make sure they understand it's not about hate. It's about protection." That night, Bumpy lay awake in the darkness, Mamie sleeping beside him. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. His father on his knees in the mud, his years learning patience, the kingdom he'd built, the people he protected, the principles he lived by. And he thought about the next 24 hours, about Vincent Calibri, about 50 pieces, about the message he would send. This isn't about hate, he thought. It's about love. Love for Harlem. Love for Mamie. Love for everyone who chose to follow him, to trust him, to believe in him. That love demanded protection, and protection sometimes required becoming exactly the monster that others feared. 50 pieces, Bumpy thought as sleep finally came. Not for revenge, not for pride, but because love is worth defending, and those who threaten it need to understand the cost. The sun rose on March 8, 1941. The last day Vincent "Vinny Spit" Calibri would see, though he didn't know it yet. 7 in the evening, March 8, 1941. The Apollo Theater blazed with light like a beacon in the Harlem darkness. 200 people packed inside, musicians, hustlers, businessmen, politicians, working folks who'd saved up for a Friday night out. Everyone dressed in their finest. Suits pressed sharp, dresses that shimmered under the stage lights, hair slicked back or pinned up with pearls. But underneath the elegance, underneath the laughter and conversation, something else moved through that crowd. A feeling, a sense that tonight was different. People couldn't name it, couldn't explain it, but they felt it in their bones. The way animals sense an earthquake before it hits. Ella Fitzgerald stood on stage, her voice floating through the smoke-filled air. She was singing "A Tisket, A Tasket," but there was something wrong with the way she sang it. Too careful, too controlled, like she was singing at a funeral instead of a celebration. Her eyes kept darting to Table 7, to the man sitting there with his wife, to Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy sat at his usual table, right side of the stage, back against the wall. Clear view of both entrances. Mamie beside him in a green silk dress that matched her eyes, white gloves on her hands, a small purse in her lap. She looked elegant, composed, but her husband could feel the tension in her body, the way her breathing was just slightly too fast. She knew. She always knew. 3 tables away, Junie Bird sat alone, pretending to enjoy the music. He wore a gray suit, a newspaper folded on the table in front of him, but his eyes never stopped moving. Scanning the room, counting exits, calculating distances. His right hand rested near his waist, inches from the gun hidden under his jacket. At the bar, Illinois Gordon nursed a whiskey, 6'4" shoulders like a linebacker impossible to miss. But he stood perfectly still, almost statue-like, and that stillness made people's eyes slide past him. He looked like decoration, furniture, until you looked at his eyes and saw the violence waiting there like a coiled spring. Near the kitchen door, Raymond Quick Lewis chatted with a waitress, making her laugh. His smile was warm, his posture relaxed, but every few seconds his hand would touch the handle of the knife hidden in his belt. Just checking. Making sure. Ready. The air in the Apollo felt thick, heavy, like breathing through wet cotton. Conversations were quieter than usual. Laughter came too quick, too nervous. Forks scraped against plates louder than they should. Ice in glasses clinked like warning bells. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. They just didn't know what. That feeling would prove correct sooner than anyone expected. 11:15 at night. Ella Fitzgerald was between songs taking a sip of water when the front doors of the Apollo Theater slammed open. Not pushed. Slammed. Hard enough that the sound echoed through the entire room like a gunshot. Cold air rushed in. The candles on the tables nearest the door flickered and nearly went out. And through that doorway walked Vincent Calibri, 6'2", 240, shoulders that seemed to fill the entire frame. He wore a black suit, black shirt, black tie, like he was dressed for a funeral. His own, though he didn't know it yet. Behind him came 4 men, all Italian, all armed. The bulges under their jackets were obvious, deliberate. They wanted people to see the guns. That was part of the message. We're armed. We're dangerous. And we don't care who knows it. Vinny's shoes hit the wooden floor. Tap. Heavy, deliberate. Tap. Like a hammer on an anvil. Tap. Each step loud enough to hear over the silence that had fallen across the room, because conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Forks had frozen mid-bite. Even breathing seemed to pause. Charles, the Apollo's manager, a thin man in a tuxedo, rushed forward from the side office. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry, but we're at full capacity tonight. If you'd like to make a reservation for another evening, I'd be happy to." Vinny's hand shot out. grabbed Charles by the front of his tuxedo, lifted him up on his toes. "We're not staying," Vinny said, his voice carrying across the room. "We're just delivering a message." Then he threw Charles sideways into the wall. The manager hit hard, his head making a sickening thud against the plaster, and he slid down to the floor, dazed. No one moved to help him. No one dared. Ella Fitzgerald's hand went to her throat. The microphone in front of her picked up the sound of her sharp intake of breath, amplified it through the speakers. Then she stepped back from the microphone, away from whatever was about to happen. The band members behind her set down their instruments, slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might trigger an explosion. 200 people sat frozen, watching, waiting. And Vinny Calibri started walking toward table 7. Each step built the tension higher. The first step, people were still whispering to each other. "What's happening? Who is that?" The second step, the whispers got quieter. The third step, someone dropped a glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound impossibly loud. By the fifth step, the whispers had died completely. Steps 6 through 10, you could hear breathing. 200 people inhaling and exhaling, but trying to do it quietly, like they were hiding from a predator. Someone's shoe scraped against the floor. A woman's pearl necklace clicked as she turned her head to watch Vinny pass her table. Steps 11 through 15, the breathing stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. The kind that makes you realize how loud the world normally is. Even the street noise from outside seemed to fade. No cars, no voices, nothing. Just Vinny's footsteps. Tap, tap, tap. Steps. 16 through 19, time seemed to slow down. Each step took forever. Each step brought Vinny closer to table 7, closer to Bumpy Johnson, closer to something that couldn't be taken back. People's hearts were beating so loud they could hear them in their own ears. Thud, 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 thud. Step 20. Vinny stopped, 3 feet from Bumpy's table, looking down at the man who ruled Harlem. The two men locked eyes. Vinny's eyes were full of arrogance, triumph. The certainty of a man who thinks he's already won. His mouth curved into a smile, not a friendly smile. A smile like a knife blade. Bumpy's eyes were different, empty, hollow, like looking into a deep well with no bottom. No anger there, no fear. Just nothing. A void. And somehow that nothingness was more terrifying than any emotion could have been. People at the surrounding tables felt it, felt that emptiness radiating from Bumpy like cold air from ice. Something was wrong. Bumpy Johnson was too calm, too still. When a man like Bumpy Johnson didn't react to a threat, it meant one thing. He was already 10 steps ahead. He'd already decided what was going to happen next. And whatever he'd decided, it was going to be terrible. But Vinny didn't see it. Didn't understand it. He was too busy enjoying his moment. Bumpy Johnson. Vinny said. His voice was loud, theatrical, meant for the audience. The great godfather of Harlem. Bumpy didn't respond. He was cutting chicken on his plate. Precise cuts. The knife moving through the meat with surgical accuracy. He placed a piece in his mouth, chewed, slowly, swallowed. Then he reached for his water glass, took a sip, set it down gently. All without looking up at Vinny. "My bosses sent me here with a message," Vinny continued. He leaned forward, hands on the table, bringing his face closer to Bumpy's. "Harlem's about to get new management. And if you're smart, you'll step aside now. While you still can." Bumpy set down his knife and fork. Aligned them perfectly on the plate, wiped his mouth with his napkin, folded the napkin and placed it beside his plate. Then finally he looked up at Vinny. "I'm listening," Bumpy said. His voice was quiet, soft, almost gentle, but it carried through the silent room like a whisper in an empty church. "You're listening," Vinny laughed. The sound was harsh, mocking. "You're listening like a good little dog." That was the moment everything changed. Vinny leaned down, closer, his face now inches from Bumpy's. He tilted his head back, gathered saliva in his mouth, and spat. Hard. Directly into Bumpy Johnson's face. The world shifted into slow motion. The spit arced through the air, spinning, catching the stage lights, glittering like a diamond. 1 second felt like 10. The droplet hung suspended in time and space. You could see every detail. The way it refracted light. The way it wobbled as it flew. The trajectory that would end on Bumpy's left cheek. Then it hit. Splat. The sound of water hitting skin. But in the absolute silence of the Apollo Theater, it sounded like a gunshot, like the crack of a whip, like the breaking of the world. The spit ran down Bumpy's cheek, slow, thick, dripping toward his jaw. A small drop fell onto his white shirt collar, spreading into a dark stain. Mamie's hand clenched around her purse so tight her knuckles went white. Her eyes filled with tears. But she didn't look away, didn't turn her head, just stared at her husband, waiting to see what he would do. 3 tables away, Junie Bird's hand moved to his waistband, touched the grip of his gun. His finger slid inside the trigger guard. He started to stand up, ready to paint the Apollo's walls red with Vinny's blood. At the bar, Illinois Gordon rose to his full height, 6'4", suddenly seeming like 7 feet. His massive hands closed into fists. He took 1 step forward, then another, moving toward table 7 like a tank rolling into battle. By the kitchen door, Raymond Quick Lewis pulled the knife from his belt. 8 inches of steel, sharp enough to split hair. His eyes locked on Vinny's throat, calculating. 1 throw, that's all it would take. 1 throw, and Vinny Calibri would bleed out in 30 seconds. But Bumpy held up 1 finger. Just 1. The gesture was tiny, almost invisible. But Junie saw it. Illinois saw it. Raymond saw it. And they all stopped. Froze mid-motion. Waiting. 200 people weren't breathing. Hearts weren't beating. Time itself seemed to stop. Bumpy reached for his napkin, the white linen square he'd folded earlier, picked it up with the same slow, methodical precision. He wiped his left cheek. Once. Gentle, thorough. Then he wiped his jaw. Once. Then his neck. Once. Then the collar of his shirt. Once. Each motion deliberate, controlled, like he was performing a ritual, like this was a ceremony that required exact movements. Then he folded the napkin. Precise creases. Perfect angles. The shape that emerged was unmistakable. A coffin. Small. Perfect. He placed it on the table next to his plate, aligned it with the edge, made sure it was exactly straight. Then Bumpy Johnson stood up. Slowly. So slowly that every inch of his rising seemed to take a year. 5'9", 170 pounds. But as he stood, his shadow on the wall behind him stretched. 10 feet. 12 feet. Reaching toward the ceiling like a giant, like something much larger than human. His eyes changed. That emptiness was still there. But now there was something else, something burning deep in that void. Not anger, not rage. Something colder. Something absolute. The look of a man who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. Not by God. Not by death. Not by anything. Count to 50, Bumpy said. His voice was still quiet, still soft. But every person in that room heard him clearly. The words cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Vinny's smile wavered. What? 50, Bumpy repeated. That's how many pieces we're going to find you in. Vinny tried to laugh again, but the sound came out wrong. Strangled. Forced. His eyes darted left and right, looking at his 4 bodyguards, looking for support, looking for confirmation that he was still winning. You threatening me, Vinny said, but his voice wasn't as loud now, not as confident. In front of all these people. You know who I work for, I know exactly who you work for. Bumpy said, "and after tonight they're going to know exactly who I am." Bumpy looked past Vinny to the 4 bodyguards. "You 4, you can leave now. Walk out that door. Go back to Little Italy. Tell Michael Genovese what happened here. You've got 10 seconds. One of the bodyguards, younger than the others, his face pale with sweat, looked at Vinny. "Boss, maybe we should shut up," Vinny snapped. He turned back to Bumpy. "I'm not going anywhere." Bumpy looked at his watch. 11:32. He showed the watch face to Vinny. "See this 11:32. You have until 11:33 to walk out that door. 60 seconds. After that you don't leave. Ever." Or what Vinny said. But his voice cracked on the second word. "Or you'll find out why the 5 families cross the street when they see me coming." 60 seconds. The clock started ticking, but it felt like each second lasted an hour. The first 15 seconds, Vinny stood there trying to smile, trying to look confident. But sweat was rolling down his temples now, dripping onto his collar. His hands opened and closed. Nervous, uncertain. 15 to 30 seconds. Vinny's bodyguards were shifting their weight from foot to foot, looking at each other. One of them touched Vinny's elbow. "Boss, we should go. We got what we came for." 30 to 45 seconds. Junie Bird stood up from his table. Illinois Gordon moved away from the bar. Raymond Quick Lewis stepped out from the kitchen door. All 3 of them visible now. All 3 of them moving slowly toward table 7, not threatening, not rushing, just moving, closing in, like wolves circling prey. 45 to 55 seconds. One of the bodyguards whispered urgently, "Vinny, let's go. This feels wrong. This feels really wrong." 55 to 58 seconds. Vinny looked into Bumpy's eyes, really looked. And for the first time he saw what Mamie had seen, what Junie, Illinois, and Raymond had always known. Death, not metaphorical death. Real death. The absolute certainty that if he stayed in this room one more second, he would never leave it alive. 11:33. 59 seconds. 60. Vinny turned and walked toward the door. Fast. Almost running. His 4 bodyguards followed, nearly tripping over each other in their hurry to leave. The front doors slammed behind them. The cold air rushed in again. Then the doors closed. Silence. Bumpy sat down, picked up his fork and knife, cut another piece of chicken, placed it in his mouth, chewed, swallowed, took a sip of water. Then he looked at Mamie. "It's done," he said. Mamie's eyes searched his face. "What did you just do?" "I kept a promise," Bumpy said. "To myself. To you. To Harlem." She knew what that meant, and despite everything, despite the terror she felt, despite knowing what was about to happen in the next few hours, she felt a surge of pride. Her husband had just been publicly humiliated, spat on like an animal, in front of 200 people. And he hadn't lost control. Hadn't let emotion dictate his response. He'd made Vinny think he'd won, and that false victory would be the last thing Vincent Calibri ever felt. Junie Bird folded his newspaper, left a $20 bill on the table, and walked toward the kitchen exit. Illinois Gordon finished his whiskey, set the glass down gently, and disappeared through the side door. Raymond Quick Lewis said goodbye to the waitress, smiled at her one more time, and vanished into the shadows near the stage. All 3 of them heading for different exits. All 3 of them with the same destination. Street 126, where Vincent Calibri's car was parked, where the trap would spring shut. Ella Fitzgerald, after a moment of heavy silence, stepped back to the microphone. Her hands were shaking, but she started singing again. A slow, mournful jazz standard. Her voice trembled on every note. The band joined in, but they played quietly, carefully, like they were performing at a wake. 200 people tried to return to their meals, their conversations, their drinks. But everyone knew. Everyone understood what they'd just witnessed. They'd seen Bumpy Johnson draw a line. They'd seen a man cross it. and they all knew with absolute certainty that Vincent Calibri was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. Outside the Apollo, the Harlem night was cold and dark. Vincent Calibri stood on the sidewalk, laughing, laughing. His 4 bodyguards stood around him, silent, nervous. "Did you see his face?" Vinny said, his voice too loud, too forced. "I spat on him. Right in his face, and he did nothing. The great Bumpy Johnson, and he just sat there like a coward." The bodyguards didn't laugh, didn't smile. One of them, the older one with gray at his temples, said quietly, "Vinny, we should get out of Harlem. Now." Something about that didn't feel right. Didn't feel right. Vinny turned on him. "I just proved he's weak. I just showed all of Harlem that their king is nothing. This is the best night of my life. Let's at least stay together," another bodyguard said. Safety in numbers, but Vinny shook his head. "No. You guys take a cab back to Mulberry Street. I'm driving. I want to enjoy this. Want to drive through Harlem slow, let everyone see me. Let them know I walked into the Apollo, disrespected their king, and walked out alive." The bodyguards exchanged glances. Uncertainty. Fear. But Vinny was their boss. They couldn't refuse. They flagged down a taxi, piled in, and disappeared into the night. Vincent Calibri stood alone on the sidewalk, pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a long drag, smiled, started walking toward his car, a black Buick parked on 126th Street, half a block away. He was humming, actually humming a tune, happy, victorious, completely unaware that 3 men were already moving through the darkness, already positioning themselves, already preparing to teach him the last lesson he would ever learn. Vinny reached his Buick, fumbled in his pocket for his keys, found them, brought them out. And every streetlight on the block went out. 3 seconds of absolute darkness. No moon. No stars behind the clouds. Just pure, complete black. Vinny froze. He heard footsteps. Behind him. Fast. Running. He started to turn, started to reach for his gun. Wham! Junie Bird's fist connected with Vinny's temple. Precise. Perfectly placed. Exactly the spot where a blow would cause instant unconsciousness without permanent damage. Not yet. Bumpy wanted him conscious for what came next. Vinny's legs buckled. He went down like a falling tree. Didn't even have time to put his hands out. Just collapsed onto the pavement. Out cold. The streetlights came back on. Illinois Gordon stepped out of the shadows, holding the circuit breaker box he'd just switched. Raymond Quick Lewis appeared from behind a parked car. All 3 men moved with practiced efficiency. They picked up Vinny's unconscious body, opened the trunk of his own Buick, dumped him inside, closed the trunk. No words, no wasted motion. 30 seconds from lights out to lights on. And Vincent Calibri had vanished from the streets of Harlem like he'd never existed. Illinois got behind the wheel of the Buick. Junie and Raymond climbed into the back seat. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly. No squealing tires, no rush. Just a car driving through Harlem at night. Completely normal. Completely unremarkable. Destination Red Hook, Brooklyn. The warehouse. The spot where problems disappeared. The stage Bumpy Johnson had prepared for the final act of this play. 45 minutes later, the Buick pulled into an alley behind an abandoned warehouse. The building had been empty for years. Broken windows, graffiti on the walls. No electricity, no water, no witnesses. Just concrete and darkness and the sound of the East River lapping against the pier behind it. They dragged Vinny inside. He was starting to wake up. Groaning, his eyes fluttering. Perfect timing. They didn't want him to miss this. They sat him in the chair Junie had prepared. Heavy wood, bolted to the floor, immovable. They tied his hands behind his back, tight. Tied his ankles to the chair legs, tighter. Put duct tape over his mouth. 3 layers. Couldn't scream, could barely breathe through his nose. Vinny's eyes snapped open, wild, confused. He tried to move. Couldn't. Tried to speak. Couldn't. Panic set in. He thrashed against the restraints. The chair didn't budge. He made muffled sounds through the tape. Mpoch. But in that empty warehouse in the middle of the night, no one could hear him. No one would come. The warehouse door opened. A figure stepped inside, backlit by the streetlight outside, silhouette, shadow. But Vinny knew who it was before his eyes adjusted to see the face. Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy walked slowly into the warehouse, his hands in his pockets, calm, unhurried, like he was taking an evening stroll. He walked in a circle around Vinny's chair. Once, twice, just looking, observing, like an artist studying a canvas before beginning to paint. "You're awake," Bumpy said. "Good. I wanted you conscious for this, conscious for every moment, every second, every realization." Vinny tried to speak through the tape, tried to threaten, tried to beg. Impossible to tell which. Just muffled sounds. "You spat in my face," Bumpy continued, still walking in that slow circle. "In front of my wife, in front of 200 people who trust me to protect them, in front of Harlem. My Harlem. You thought that made you powerful. You thought that made you strong." Bumpy stopped walking, stood directly in front of Vinny, looked down at him. "But you didn't understand what power really is. Power isn't making people fear you. Any fool with a gun can do that. Real power is making people understand. Understanding that actions have consequences. That respect isn't optional. That some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed." He leaned down, his face inches from Vinny's, close enough that Vinny could see his own terrified reflection in Bumpy's eyes. And now Bumpy whispered, "You're going to help me teach that lesson to everyone. To the Genovese family. To every mafia soldier in New York. To anyone who ever thinks about testing me again. You're going to be the message that lasts forever." Bumpy straightened up, looked at Junie, Illinois, and Raymond. 50 minutes. 1 minute for each piece. Make sure he understands. But don't let him die too quickly. Then Bumpy walked out of the warehouse. The door closed behind him with a heavy final sound. Like a tomb sealing shut. Outside, Bumpy sat on the hood of the Buick, lit a cigar, looked up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. He checked his watch. 1:30 in the morning, and he waited. Calm. Patient. Smoking his cigar and thinking about Mamie, about Harlem, about respect, about the price of protecting what you love. Inside the warehouse, silence. Then the sound of water running through the drain in the center of the floor. Steady. Continuous. For 50 minutes that sound never stopped, but no screams came out. The tape ensured that. Just water. Running. Draining into the East River, carrying away all evidence, all trace, all proof. At 2:20 in the morning, exactly 50 minutes later, the warehouse door opened. Junie, Illinois, and Raymond stepped out. Their clothes were clean. Their hands were washed. Their faces showed nothing. Empty. Professional. The look of men who'd done a difficult job with precision and care. "It's done," Junie said. 50 pieces. Exactly as you specified. Bumpy nodded. "Dispose of them according to the map. 7 locations. Make sure the message is clear. Make sure everyone understands." The 3 men nodded and went back inside. They had 7 packages to deliver to 7 different locations across New York. Each location carefully chosen, each placement deliberate, each piece a word in a sentence that would read, "This is what happens when you disrespect Bumpy Johnson." March 9th, 1941, 6 in the morning. A sanitation worker named Thomas Davis was making his rounds in Red Hook, checking dumpsters, collecting trash. He lifted the lid on a dumpster behind a fish market and found something that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. He ran 3 blocks before he stopped screaming, called the police from a payphone. his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. By noon, the police had found 6 more pieces in the East River, in a trash can in the Bronx, behind a building in Queens. Each discovery brought more detectives, more questions, more horror. By evening, the entire New York underworld knew. Vincent "Vinny" Spit Calibri was dead. Not just dead, dismembered, scattered, 50 pieces. Exactly 50. Someone had counted. Someone had planned this down to the smallest detail. March 11th, 1941. Morning. A delivery truck pulled up to the Mulberry Street Social Club. The driver, a young man who looked terrified, carried a box to the front door, set it down, knocked, ran back to his truck and drove away faster than the speed limit allowed. Michael Genovese opened the door, looked down at the box, plain cardboard, no label, no return address. He brought it inside, set it on the table where 8 days ago they'd planned Vincent Calibri's mission. He opened the box. Inside was Vincent Calibri's head, eyes still open, mouth frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and pinned to his forehead with a small knife was a note. Handwritten, elegant script. It read, "Piece number 50. There are 49 others. This is what disrespect costs in Harlem." Signed, Bumpy Johnson. The NYPD opened an investigation. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd been at the Apollo Theater that night. 200 witnesses. 200 statements. Every single one said the same thing: "I didn't see anything. I don't remember anything unusual. It was just a normal night." Ella Fitzgerald sang beautifully. They interviewed Mamie Johnson. She sat in the police station, elegant in a blue dress, hands folded in her lap. The detective asked her, "Did you see Vincent Calibri at the Apollo on March 8th? Mamie smiled softly. "I saw Ella Fitzgerald perform. She was magnificent. That's what I remember about that night." "Did your husband have any interaction with Mr. Calibri?" "My husband ate dinner and enjoyed the show. That's all." The detective knew she was lying. Everyone knew. But there was no evidence. No witnesses would testify. No one would break the wall of silence that Harlem had built around Bumpy Johnson. Junie Bird, Illinois Gordon, and Raymond Quick Lewis had vanished. Like ghosts. The police couldn't find them. Couldn't even prove they'd been at the Apollo that night. It was like they didn't exist. 72 hours after the first piece was found, the case was closed. Unsolved. The file went into a cabinet. The detective in charge wrote one word on the cover: untouchable. Because in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was exactly that. March 12th, 1941. The Mulberry Street Social Club. Emergency meeting. Michael Genovese sat at the head of the table, Vincent Calibri's head still in the box beside him. 8 captains sat around the table, silent, nervous. No one wanted to speak first. Michael slammed his fist on the table. "Bumpy Johnson just killed one of our men and scattered him across the city like confetti. We can't let this stand. We go to war. We burn Harlem to the ground." But the older captains, the ones who'd survived by being smart instead of brave, said nothing. They just looked at each other, waiting. Then the door opened and Frank Costello walked in. Frank Costello was Lucky Luciano's successor, the man who'd negotiated with every family in New York and lived to tell about it. He was 60 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than most men made in a year. He sat down at the table without being invited, lit a cigar, looked at the box, looked at Michael. 50 pieces, Costello said quietly. Not 49. Not 51. Exactly 50. You think that's random? Michael stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying that wasn't murder. That was a message. Bumpy Johnson counted every piece, planned every location, executed it with precision. That's not a gangster. That's a general. And you don't go to war with a general unless you're ready to lose everything. One of the captains leaned forward. "So what do we do?" "Just accept this." Costello took a long drag on his cigar. "You sent a man to spit in his face. in his territory, in front of his people. What did you think was going to happen? That he'd bow down? Bumpy Johnson doesn't negotiate from weakness. He eliminates threats so completely that no one dares become the next threat. That's the rule in Harlem, and we need to respect it. But he cut up one of our men into 50 pieces. Michael's voice cracked. Exactly 50, Costello repeated. That number means something. It means he's patient, methodical, and more dangerous than all of us combined. So here's what we do. We leave Harlem alone. We find our money somewhere else. Because trying to take Harlem from Bumpy Johnson will cost us more soldiers, more money, and more respect than it's worth. The room fell silent. Michael looked around the table at his captains, saw fear in their eyes. They'd all seen what Bumpy could do. None of them wanted to be piece number 51. The decision was made. Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson. Untouchable, unreachable, forever. That message spread through the 5 families faster than fire through dry wood. Within a week, every mafia soldier in New York knew the story. Within a month, it had reached Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. Bumpy Johnson became legend. The man you didn't test. The line you didn't cross. The king who wore his crown without ever having to prove it again. Back in Harlem, life continued, but it was different now. Quieter, more respectful. People still talked about that night at the Apollo, but they talked in whispers, like speaking too loud might summon something dark. The Apollo Theater put a small bronze plaque near table 7. It didn't mention Vincent Calibri, didn't mention the 50 pieces, just 13 words. Respect is earned, not taken. March 8, 1941. Everyone who saw it understood. Bumpy Johnson returned to his routines. Morning walks through Harlem, stopping at Ernestine's bakery, leaving money at PS 119, paying Mrs. Patterson's rent. He was the same man. Quiet, polite, generous. But now when he walked down the street, people didn't just respect him, they revered him. He'd proven something that couldn't be unproven, that respect had boundaries. And crossing those boundaries had consequences that lasted forever. No one ever tested Bumpy Johnson again. No mafia family. No rival gangster. No one. The lesson of 50 pieces was too clear. Too permanent. Too terrifying. 3 nights after the warehouse, Bumpy came home late. Mamie was sitting in bed reading a book. She looked up when he entered, set the book aside, watched him undress, hang up his suit, put his cufflinks in the dish on the dresser. When he climbed into bed beside her, she finally spoke. "Are you afraid of what you've become?" she asked softly. Bumpy was quiet for a long moment, then every single day. "But I'm more afraid of what would happen to you to Harlem if I hadn't become this." Mamie reached out, touched his face. "We chose this life together, both of us." With open eyes, they lay in silence, holding each other, both understanding that power had a price, that protection required sacrifice, that love sometimes meant becoming exactly the thing you feared, but also understanding that respect, real respect, the kind that protected innocent people and built communities, was worth more than innocence, worth more than comfort, worth everything. The story of 50 pieces spread beyond New York, beyond the criminal world. It became legend. Parents told it to children. Children told it to grandchildren. For 80 years, the story persisted. Some details changed, some got exaggerated, but the core remained. Bumpy Johnson taught Harlem, taught America that respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn. And when someone disrespects you publicly, completely, without remorse, the response must be equally complete. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of principle. Out of the understanding that some lines exist for a reason, and crossing them has consequences. The lesson wasn't about violence. It was about boundaries, about the price of disrespect, about understanding that real power doesn't need to prove itself until it's tested. And when it's tested, the response must be so clear, so absolute that it never needs to be repeated. 1 month later, Bumpy returned to the Apollo Theater. Friday night, Ella Fitzgerald performing again. He sat at table 7. Mamie beside him in the same green dress. The room fell silent when he entered. Not out of fear, out of respect. Ella sang the same song she'd been singing that night. A tisket, a tasket. But this time her voice was strong, confident, because she knew she was safe. Everyone in Harlem was safe, because Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line and defended it. Bumpy ordered chicken, cut it with the same precision, ate slowly, enjoyed the music, and thought about everything that had happened. 50 pieces was a promise kept, but Harlem, intact Harlem, safe Harlem, thriving, that was the real legacy. He looked at Mamie, smiled. She smiled back, both of them understanding without words. Power wasn't about making people fear you, it was about making them understand. Understand that you would protect them, understand that you had principles, understand that those principles were non-negotiable, and understand that crossing those lines meant consequences that lasted forever. That was real power, not the violence, the understanding that came after, the respect that was earned through action, not words, the legacy that outlasted the man who created it. Bumpy Johnson taught that lesson once, and it never needed to be taught again.